I'll tell you what, boy, just for those of you who've got secondary school children and primary school children throughout New Zealand at the moment, this flu's going around, isn't it, eh? And in both islands. And here's something else, Josh, that you won't be aware of, and neither will any single people who don't have secondary school age children at the moment. This is tournament week. Now, this is typical teachers, okay? This is typical effing teachers. I've got no time for school teachers and their selfishness and their antics. And there's a reason why we've been dumbing down the profession over the last 50 years, and that's because it's losing its luster and its reputation and its prestige amongst the rest of us. But this is tournament week. Now, tournament week used to be in the school holidays, all right? So as not to interfere with the learning of kids.
I was just going to say that we used to have it in the school holidays.
Now wait for this. This is bloody teachers now, and bloody selfish secondary school teachers in particular. They're now running all throughout, as I talk to you now, all throughout New Zealand. There'll be thousands, very possibly tens of thousands, but certainly thousands of kids are now participating in tournament week. They're playing netball, they're playing rugby, they're playing soccer, football, they're playing hockey. They're all throughout New Zealand, there are a whole series of tournaments that are taking place as I talk to you right now. Started yesterday morning. There were some games on Sunday afternoon, but anyhow, and it's going to go a week, right? Now, those kids, most of whom are playing at tournament week, are in their premier teams for their sports. So they'll mostly be years 11s, 12s and 13s who are playing. As I talk to you now, they're studying NCA level 1, level 2, level 3, or they have Cambridges at the end of the year for those smart schools that have decided that they want a qualification that actually can travel outside New Zealand or at least South Auckland. Anyhow, there they go now, playing their tournament sport. How many days already through either teacher-only days or teacher strikes from the PPTA and their bloody-minded and frankly appalling attempt to reward them for their own incompetence, how many days have those kids already lost? How many years are we already behind as a consequence of New Zealand's excessive, overexcited and frankly stupid COVID policy? All right? Add all this stuff together. So you'd think, wouldn't you, right, we need to make up all the time that's been lost this year and the fact that kids, particularly boys, have suffered so egregiously over the last 3 years of educational neglect and decline in this country. No, not a bit of it. Why don't we just go and send all our year 11s, 12s and 13s, for God's sake, to tournament week? Yeah, that'll work. And of course, that's a week of education that they will not be receiving. So my year 12 daughter, who isn't in any of these sporting teams, my year 10 son would be, but he's sick. She's just sitting there going, it's all right, you know? So she's still doing her English and her chemistry and her psychology. Yes, she's doing psychology. I'm sure it's to work out what her father's thinking. And she's doing a history and what else is she doing? Biology and maths. So she's still doing all her 6 subjects at year 12. She must be sitting there going, and in fact she is. She's going, I feel a bit sorry for those boys and girls because they probably needed to know that. And here I am a week ahead again. And it's a very good time to be introducing our next guest, who is Alwyn Poole, educational consultant, former primary school and intermediate, I think, school principal, and one of New Zealand's leading education commentators. Alwyn, explain to me, when did we move tournament week into during the school year?
Well, everything that's not a holiday is now in the school year. Like a teacher-only day, you have those in your school year. Parent interviews used to be in the evenings because that's when parents didn't work.
Yes, that's right. Which is still true.
Come along and meet the teachers in the evening, but now no, schools
got to close the school down.
But or they have a half day, or they have a half day, and the girl goes to a bus stop in Rotorua and gets beaten up. It's become a very strange type of phenomenon. And it's also not backed up with, I think, good processes for kids. So you're talking about your daughter there, and she'll never work out how you think, regardless of how much psychology she does.
I hope you're
right. But I remember, my two boys were good academics and good sports people. And so I'd sit down with them and I'd say, hey, look, guys, one cannot get in the way of the other here. And therefore, if you're going to do these events, now all of their events at that stage, triathlon, cycling, running, what else is there? Triathlon, cycling, running, cross country. They were all in the holidays or on weekends. So maybe they weren't playing team sports, although their cycling was very team oriented. So obviously, like you are with your daughter, we sat down and said, okay, so how are we going to make sure that you prepare well academically throughout the year, so you get a great result? Because we've got this weird thing in New Zealand where we're really over-accentuating children's sporting performance for the school's glory and not for the future of the child. And we've seen some pretty horrible examples of that. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the debacle with Scots College.
I have indeed. We'll talk about that, Alwyn, because I don't think the rest of New Zealand's quite caught up with it yet.
No, and there are a lot of examples of not seeing the best medium to long-term interests of the child. These aren't the children sort of in the dire need that, someone like John Gerritsen so brilliantly highlighted yesterday in Radio New Zealand. It's your kids who like going to school, who do enjoy being in a school team, etc., etc. But they're not being taken care of with their long-term future in mind.
No, I'll tell you something about the sports weeks that's happening throughout New Zealand as well. I bet you anything you like that a good number of those sports teams are not actually being taken by teachers, but are being taken by parents who are taking the week off to go and to coach and manage those teams.
There would certainly be a portion of that. I don't know. Some of the things, it always befuddles me when something is so clearly obvious that it's causing harm or disruption, and yet people double down and do it more.
It's still Scots now. So just to explain the issue to our listeners, Alwyn. Sorry, you are a resident in Wellington?
No, I'm in the Waikato.
In the Waikato, okay. You've got probably New Zealand's leading sports school, I would suggest to you, across a range of disciplines in your neck of the woods, which is Hamilton Boys High School, yeah?
Mm-hmm, yes.
And it's a big school though. What's it, 2,500 boys?
Yep.
So you would expect it to be pretty good for 2,500 boys, although, interestingly, earlier in the year they were caught for playing around with rowing regulations. So had a number of their rowing triumphs at the Māori Cup Regatta annulled because they'd been playing fast and loose too with the rules. Is that right?
Yeah, I've got family friends who are at another school are pretty delighted because their kids got their medals upgraded.
Right.
Not flash at all.
No. So something very similar has that. So that with Hamilton Boys High School and rowing has now happened with Scots College. Now, Scots College, just so I can declare an interest, my father was the principal there from, 1985, I think, to about 1993 or 4 in McKinnon.
Was that when it was called Snots Forage?
Oh, it probably was. It's probably always been there. But it was a pretty down-market private school when he took it over, and he was given a responsibility to uplift it. And one of the first things he did, my father, was import a couple of Fijian boys every year on a sporting scholarship for the first 15. Because his argument was that the first 15 in Wellington at that time, he's probably still true, gives your school a level of sporting, not just prowess for the kids in general, but also in terms of news coverage, gives it a profile and things like that. Now, that's obviously gone to the nth degree since my father left that school, because Scots College has now got a reputation as attracting the best, usually Pacific Island boys, many of whom have ex-All Black families, I might add, fathers, on sporting scholarships to create one of the better rugby teams in this country. And I actually watched them also, Alwyn, play the Wellington final against St Pat's Silverstream about a month ago, which they won by 2 points. They only have a first 15 because they recruit those kids. So their second, their third and their fourth 15s are useless. So there's no bring the kids through, they go up into the first 15, right, as there is at, for example, St Pat's Silverstream and other schools in this country. Scots College just have a first 15. And they were to play, now you pick up the story from here, they were to play, they won the Wellington competition, they beat Stream by 2 points. Yeah. And they were to play a state secondary school called Fielding, a co-ed school, no less, in the semi-final to determine who would be the Hurricanes representative for the top first 15 rugby team, top 4 competition. You take it up from here, mate.
Yeah, well, I mean, I watched a video this morning, actually, where it seemed that Fielding somehow knew that something was up. And they put someone on a roof somewhere and sort of, instead of videoing the game, they videoed the coaches and the going-ons with the reserves. And so what very much seems to have been the case is that, first of all, Scots turned up with 6 reserves, which is allowable. 5 isn't. And you have to have because of the injury worry, you have to have someone who replacements for the front row, because clearly you can't put someone into a front row who's not got a strong neck, good technique. They'll get hurt. So about 10 minutes in, with Fielding doing pretty well, Scots had to make an injury replacement, and they suddenly asserted that they didn't have
for one of the front row, for one of the props, as I understand.
Yes, they didn't have a front row reserve, and then it looks, and I'm not asserting it's the case, but it certainly looks the case that they took one of their players off the bench, got him changed back into number ones, and then went down and explained that they only had X number of reserves, and that's why they had to go to Golden Oldies scrums. So they subsequently won the game. A protest went in from Fielding, quite fairly. Apparently, Fielding rang the wrong person in the first place, which is, I would say, who cares, as long as it ended up in the right place. And so on that technicality, it by and large seems to have been thrown out. And then so that the final declaration of who was the winner of that game happened on the Friday night, or on the Friday. And on the Friday evening, Scott said, well, we haven't got enough healthy players, we're not going to turn up and play Palmerston North Boys High. And so Fielding, who did everything right, I guess except score more points on the day, they didn't get to play the final either.
No.
And I think there's a lot to flow out of this yet, and it looks, in all details published in the Herald today, that there's been a bit of a history there. And again, I would say
there's no question about that.
Giving things out of proportion.
Yeah.
I used to coach the university premier men's team in Auckland, and at times we'd get a bit of critique that. And they were pretty good. But our view, Gary Bragg and my view, always was that right up until the semi-finals, if a player had turned up to training during the week, etc., it was club rugby after all, that they would get to play for at least 30 minutes on the Saturday. And we felt that was, sort of really good practice and kept things in proportion. I mean, we're talking schoolboy rugby here. What message have you sent to your squad, as well as to the wider community, if you're not prepared to, be very ethically transparent, follow the rules, and when you're caught, say, well, look, yes, you're right.
Can I tell you a bit more about this game? Because I watched that Scots First 15 play St Pat's Silverstream in the final, as I said, of the Wellington team about a month ago. Yeah. Wellington, Scots College had two huge, and when I mean huge, well, 120, 125 kilogram Samoan/Tongan props as their cornerstones for their team. They were fat, unfit, but huge. All right?
Yeah.
And I watched them play, and by the time, now, I'm not sure that most people listening will know that schoolboy rugby is 35-minute halves, it's not 40-minute halves.
Correct.
So by the end of the game, Scots College, with 10 minutes to go, were up. Stream had played poorly, and they were up something like 29-10. And so everybody thought, well, that's the end of that. And then Stream played against, scored 3 tries in the last 10 minutes, and the only reason that they didn't win was because the draw was their kicker missed a kick from almost straight in front of the final conversion.
Yeah,
Poor
you always
kid.
feel for that.
I know, he'll remember it for the rest of his life. Poor bugger.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the thing that struck me was that the Tongan boys, these huge Tongan boys, had stopped running. So one of the reasons that Stream was able to score 3 tries in the last 10 minutes was that simply they were still going. And these boys were... Now, so it was sort of inevitable, if you like, that this whole Scots team is almost entirely composed of Samoan and Tongan boys. And just quietly between you and me, Alwyn, I would suggest to you that not all of them, mum and dads, pay their fees. And my understanding was that at least Scots last year or the year beforehand had been in trouble for having too many sporting scholarships in their team. They had more than 3. So they were disqualified and not able to participate because they had imported too many kids in the last year of school to make their first 15 a team. They've also got a director of coaching, a former Hawke's Bay Otago player called Andre Bell, is a paid director of coaching at Scots. So they can afford to have a pretty good team through the mechanisms that I've just described to you. Do you think that's wrong? Because I wouldn't mind betting that there are a few Auckland schools that would be in that category too. And a few schools in Christchurch who use sporting scholarships to entice children to their schools too. Is there something innately wrong with sporting scholarships, do you think?
No. My take on it's fractionally different. Where I think that we need a genuine review to step back and say, okay, what are we doing here? So if we look at sport development in New Zealand as a whole, our biggest gap is that when you leave school, there's no university strategy. And so,
that's
a lot
right.
of our kids,
you're
a lot
right.
of our athletes, etc., they go to the US.
Yeah.
And so if we were to sit back and say, okay, so what's happening when kids leave school? And so if you take why was rugby formerly strong, well, you would, I coached the Waikato under 16s, and there's now no such thing.
Yes,
there's no
that's
Auckland under 16s.
And and that's apparently because we don't like competition, that there's no under 16 teams.
That's a lot of it. So I think we kind of need to step back a little bit and say, okay, if there's a child that has got some physical ability and is in a school where, that performance isn't going to be enhanced or etc., then I think it is acceptable for them to go somewhere else. But there needs to be some requirements around that. So, for instance, if you go to Scots College on a scholarship or wherever, we need to see that you're going to school. We need to, like a GPA in the US. I remember talking to a guy who got a baseball scholarship in San Francisco. And he walked into the coach's office and he kind of said, I'm here to play baseball. And the coach said, no, you're not, mate. You're here to get a GPA of, I think they were working on a scale of 4, a GPA of 3 before you're even allowed on the practice team. And so if we're going to have scholarships, we need to enhance the whole person. And so you've got the new-to-school rules in Wellington, you've got the new-to-school rules in Auckland, but they don't exist, for instance, in the Super 8. And I do think, and you've kind of, there's almost a lawlessness there. And then you can have a situation, for instance, where Auckland Grammar are really, adamant about these new-to-school rules, and yet they have their in-zone situation where kids come from Northland and Gisborne and places like that. I mean, Northland rugby is completely decimated at a secondary school level. Westlake win the North Harbour competition by thrashing everybody. They've got no new-to-school rules over there. And they only have to play one hard game a year. This year was against Sacred Heart to make the top 4. And so somehow there needs to be some oversight here. If you bring it back to the individual child's perspective and the future for them, I think if a school can pick up someone who is in a school where maybe they don't even have a first 15, and provide them with an opportunity, but couple with it the academics, I can't see that as being a bad thing.
Okay. And certainly, I guess, for those big Tongan Samoan boys, they will receive an education that possibly they couldn't at Mana or Poro College. I don't know. Maybe you're mixing with a different sort of person too, maybe too.
Well, when I did at University Club, you talked about these, sort of big guys. I had John Arfawa turn up when we were doing our sort of pre-season and our weight and things like that. And I looked at John, I said, how heavy are you? And he goes, 112. I said, you are not. And he was. But the reason I said you are not is because Flippy was fit and strong and remarkable. But for him, Rokokoko, Kaino, they had all come from different schools and gone to St. Ken. And I'm going to say a part of their success as All Blacks and their success as human beings had to do with that change. And sometimes we need to be realistic about that. But they were 3 pretty special kids.
Agreed. And the other thing that struck me actually watching that game was that for those Samoan and Tongan families who one presumes come from, there's a string of sort of state houses that surround Scots College, ironically, out in Seatoon Way. If they do go on and become professional rugby players, they're not just pulling themselves out of relative poverty, are they? They're pulling their parents out as well and their families.
Well, I think that's the story of Charles Fairtower. If you remember, he was, a very good All Black who didn't play many seasons because he said, you know what, my family is in such need that I can go, I think it was to England first.
Yeah, and then he went to Ireland. Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and I can lift them out. Yeah. And I think that's realistic. But the other part of that is sometimes I think schools overpromise how many well-paying positions there are in professional sport. And I mean, even in the US, they've done some neat changes recently, but something like 4% of high school football players make it to college. And something like 1% of college football players make it to the NFL. And the thing that they've recently done that's really positive for the college football players, because they'll put 90,000 people in a stadium to watch some of these games, and they're all paying, and the coaches are on millions. And the kids used to have these incredibly strict rules that they couldn't be given a can of Coke. And so now they're actually able, in some situations to set aside sponsorship and things like that, so they receive it and it goes somewhere and it's more guaranteeing to their future.
Which segues rather nicely, I have to say, into this next part of our conversation. And the reason I got you on this morning, because we've been distracted by rugby and Scots and sporting scholarships. But it is an article that I thought, I mentioned it yesterday, and you're extensively quoted in it, that New Zealand Herald, Derek Cheng wrote, headlined Election 2023, What the Dire State of Education Means for the Next Generation. They're talking about New Zealand. And it's headlined, those leaving high school are less educated, are increasingly less educated, creating the prospect of a generation more likely to struggle to make ends meet, which carries potentially severe social and, I would have thought, economic consequences. Derek Cheng explores the latest Ministry of Education data, the grim future it paints, and what has been proposed as the election looms. Now, you would have read that story, and in fact, as I said, you were extensively researched, interviewed for it, and quoted in it. Can I just ask the obvious question here? There's an awful lot of emphasis, and it segues nicely with what we've just been talking now, on Maori and Pacific Island pass rates, and how they are declining vis-a-vis, I guess, non-Maori and Pacific Island pass rates. But isn't the truth that all pass rates are declining in New Zealand?
Yes, I think, and I think there's two very clear ways of looking at it, and I think both are helpful. What you can look at ethnicity, and there are some lessons in that. You know, why are Asian students doing so significantly better, even when they're in the lower socioeconomic areas or relatively new to New Zealand, and all those sorts of things. So you can go, okay, well, what do they do? And I think it's always really important to look at what's working, because that's where your solutions have to lie once you've worked out that there's a problem. But then the second thing is to look at it from a straight socioeconomic perspective and say, okay, so why are, our what were decile 10s, our low equity index number schools, why are they doing so well comparably? And why is the gap getting bigger? And I mean, if you come back to what you were saying earlier on about things like tournament weeks and stuff like that, I think schools in many cases have got into habits where they're thinking school needs to be fun. Our kids aren't turning up. Hey, we should feed them. Although the select committee showed that that's having no effect on attendance. And in fact, someone was speaking to the other day where they're involved in providing food to a school in Northland, and someone said there's so much waste, and they went back and said there's waste because your kids aren't turning up. We're contracted to provide, I don't know, let's say 1,000 meals, and you've got 620 kids there. Of course there's going to be waste. And so we've got into this habit, and it's still one of the worst quotes I've ever heard from a school leader out in South Auckland, who said, well, the NCEA doesn't show our students in a good light. It's not NCEA that's not showing your students in a good light. It's your teaching practices. It's your achievements. It's your... and you're worried about the light that they're shown in now. You should be worried about what they can do as 24-year-olds, as 25-year-olds. And I think it comes down to leadership. And you and I have both spoken very highly of Eric at Stanford. We currently have a Minister of Education who's completely out of the depth. We have a Secretary for Education who I would say would have less than 10% name recognition in the whole country, and yet it's an incredibly important job, and she's paid $670,000 to do it. We have a Prime Minister who was a Minister of Education, and it just all filters down. It's got to change, and as I think I said to Derek, I don't know whether he used this one, but I said, look, if National just tinker if they become government and they just tinker around with education, they'll be doing no one any favours. They need to be really aspirational and laser focused.
Well, and they also need to go back to basics, and I mean basics in terms of what works, what doesn't, to understand the research.
Yeah.
Before I interviewed you this morning, I went to see what international research was out there to do with ethnic achievement, and in particular, why do East Asian students outperform Western students in PISA tests and a whole series of other international standards? Now, I would say there's an overwhelming, so the research pieces that I've seen on that particular issue over the last 5 or 10 years generally all come to the same conclusion, that it's cultural in part. But then, interestingly, they say the way in which they teach students in East Asia is different than the way in which they test in the West. And they stress that difference, the memorization, the building block approach in the East compared to the superficiality tasks done in the West. And you've just picked up, I think, on that, in which you talked about that South Auckland principle, saying, these tests don't suit our children, sort of stuff. Don't we need to actually look at that research? Because this thing that stuns me, Alwyn, and it must stun you too, is this research is sitting there. It's been done by academics internationally. It answers a large number of questions that you would think would have an instant applicability to New Zealand, but seems to be routinely ignored by those very people responsible for writing that policy and creating that learning environment. Why is that?
Well, we look after our cars better than we look after our children. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm a big fan of David Eagleman, the neuroscientist out of Stanford. And, New Zealand's got some people who speak very well into this area as well, and I think it's Nathan Wallace. I think that one of the first things that a new government needs to do is say, you know what, parenting is so incredibly important. And we're going to enhance it, and we're going to inform, and the stuff that Eagleman says about how you speak to a child, how you nurture a child, how you all of that sort of stuff. We're going to make this information so prevalent that if you don't know it, it's you're living in a cave somewhere. And we're going to increase societal expectations of parenting. And we're going to enhance their ability to know about the education system, to engage with the education system. Teachers will hate me saying this, but that, parents are the taxpayers. They are the parents of the children. That parents should be more involved, but also more demanding of what takes place in school, but have to also accept their responsibility at home. Provide a good breakfast.
But Alwyn, we know this. You and I know this. I mean, everybody that's listening to us knows this. We know that if a child comes from a good background in which there are aspirational parents, and they've got a stable environment, even if it's a single-parent family, for Pete's sake, those kids will go on and achieve irrespective of the teachers they strike or the schools that they attend. If we know this, again, why have we let the teacher profession act like basically old-fashioned monks, wall off the rest of the community from their schools and say, you may not come into our schools even, or question our methods, we know what's best?
Because I think, frankly, they don't. And in terms of the teaching profession, the first thing to do will be to say, you know what, we talk about a lifelong learning situation. If you don't have adequate math and science background in your qualifications before you become a teacher, you have to get it in the next 3 years. And I think ultimately the teachers who have to do that will be delighted, because they'll end up being able to stand in front of a class and teach science from a point of knowledge rather than that they went into primary school teaching because they didn't have any.
But also, I would have thought just quietly, if I was a school teacher, I'd welcome the parents being involved. I want somebody who can reinforce at home what I'm teaching at the classroom.
Yeah, and there's always the odd nut job. Well, it just is.
That's just the nature of the beast.
Yes, and learning how to deal with them can sometimes be a bit painful, but that's your 1 out of 20. And you know what you can do in terms of engaging with parents and having a little bit of humility, that you only see the kids, depending on whether you're a primary or secondary school teacher, you only see them for a small part of their week, in a very small part of their lifetime. You're not as important as you think you are. You're there to do a really good job, but acknowledge the other things that are important in those kids' lives, like their parents. And you know, we've got an amazing resource out in our society in terms of over 65. You know, concepts of having sort of teacher aides and people in school that can read and can read to kids. And
yeah, but they're different values, mate. I mean, sorry, if I went as a teacher aide as a 65-year-old, how long will I last? A day? An hour? I mean, seriously.
Well, it depends. It depends how they're used, and I think there might be a transition period, but
that's probably right.
Yeah. I mean, things have to change. I mean, that's the message from Derek Cheng's article. It's the message from, you know, John Garrett's in the article where he just about had to prize these reports out of the Ministry of Education about what truancy officers were saying about just how disengaged so many families are. And the response of schools, you know, schools turning down kids that are in their zone. You're not allowed to. And all sorts of things like this. It really is.
Listen, mate, Alwyn, you can... listen, the reason I had you on was because, A, you know your stuff, and B, you're empirically based. So does something work? Can you show that it works? There's, you know, you're not into ideology per se. You're into what works. And you've also got enough experience in the world to know that it will depend. For some kids that will work, for some kids it won't. You've just got to be flexible enough in your teaching and things like that. But I'm starting to get pessimistic. I'm starting to think in a female-dominated primary education system, in which the academic ability of the educators is nowhere near what it was 30, 40 years ago, just looking by the average of the degrees that have been gained, and in which the Education Review Office has independently said that one of the reasons we've got poor maths and science, particularly in our primary schools, is because the teachers don't like teaching it.
Well, they don't know it.
Well, exactly, but they don't, and A, don't know it, B, don't like it, so C, they don't teach it properly or adequately. In some cases, not at all. I'm sorry, we're talking systemic change here. We're talking a revolution required. We're not talking about tinkering around. We're not talking about, you know, and all this shit, to be perfectly honest, I'm sorry to use the word, of praising the teaching profession, saying, oh, we've got really good teachers out there. And I'm saying, well, if they were, this would work. But we don't have good teachers out there. We have mediocrity, would seem to be the primary word if you would describe the teaching profession in this country.
Well, the whole contract negotiations and strikes and rolling stoppages and all that was predicated on complaints. Kids are harder to teach, you know, society's changed, teachers aren't as highly valued, and all this sort of stuff. And so, again, children are really observant. In other words, my teacher doesn't like really doing their job. They need to be paid more to look after, you know, someone like me. And that as a general theme just becomes, and has been for a while now, a malaise. You know, and you'll have people quite publicly say, well, why on earth would you become a teacher? And if I went back 20, 30 years now, I do exactly the same. I love the job, love working with kids, looking to go back into a school next year once I've got another project up and running here that I'm doing. And because I like working with young people.
What age group will you be dealing with, Alwyn?
I don't know. I'm looking at 2 or 3 options at the moment. I know what my preference for work would be, and that would be to be in a certain politician's office.
Oh, okay.
But those decisions can't be made until after the election.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think.
Well, they're certainly going to need seriously if you're going to come in, and you don't need to say so much, and I don't want you to breach confidence and things like that, but they are going to need very strong individuals with an independent point of view who are able to say that's bollocks, be able to see as those education reports come in and ministry officials walk into a room, be able to independently question them and hold them to account, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I love watching NFL and, just how tough the training and the coaching is. And there's a particular guy called Bill Belichick who, was a legend, and once Brady and Gronkowski left, he's had some work to do to get back up to that same standard with New England. But I mean, his most common saying is, "Do your job," and that's it. And if you do yours and everyone else does theirs, we're on the right way. And what's your job in education in New Zealand? It's to improve the future outcomes of young people.
Yeah,
it's nothing in.
But one of the things that you're going to be instantly fighting, and everybody listening to this will know, is ideology. This belief that there is a world that teachers, the teaching profession, the teacher unions, the teacher policymakers in Wellington want to create. It's their world. It has a particular ideology that streams through it. And it doesn't necessarily say, for example, that success is the end-all and be-all. It doesn't say that getting to be the best that you can be is necessarily the end objective. Sorry, Karen.
It isn't necessarily. I mean, one of the real tragedies here is, we're having kids who can't read.
Correct.
A genuine book.
Yep.
So they miss out on that life enjoyment of sitting there and going, I mean, I remember reading flipping War and Peace by Tolstoy, and I haven't been able to read it again because it was an effort. But in the end, you just go, flip, a human being can be this good that he wrote this book, that he understood these people. And so you aspire and you think, flip, there's a big gap between what I thought a human could be intellectually and what a human can actually be intellectually. And you can do that by going into wider workshops, and having a look at what people do. But if we're not demanding we don't expose people to being towards their best, they also miss out on a massive amount of life enjoyment. And it diminishes them as human beings. And so when you look at, as you say, a lot of these ideologies, particularly the ideologies of sort of, equity or equality regardless of effort or merit, you bring everyone down.
Yes, you do.
And it's horrid. And as a country, we are paying a price. And you might have noticed, but I think the International Monetary Fund have projected that New Zealand will have the lowest economic growth, I think, apart from Equatorial Guinea, for the projected future if current pathways are kept. What are we doing?
Yep. Alwyn, thank you for joining us. We will talk more. Yes, but tomorrow the National Party releases its taxation policy, so that will be interesting of its own self. But thank you for joining us on this.
My pleasure.
Yep. Look after yourself, mate. And we'll see who wins. Who are you backing for the top 4, by the way? I think they play this Saturday and Sunday.
Well, I have to say I taught at Tauranga Boys and I coached their first 15 for 3 years. So Tauranga Boys, by a significant margin, over Westlake and over whoever has the misfortune to play them in the final.
Okay.
Is that bias?
All right. Well, check on Monday. So you got it right. You may well have. Alwyn, thank you so much for joining us. Have a very good day, my friend. Yes, for those of you who do follow rugby or schools sport, The 4 rugby teams who are in the top 4, all underdogs, so they shouldn't be there. What does that mean? It means they've beaten more favoured competition to represent it. The top 4 in New Zealand for first 15 works on the basis that there's one team for the South Island. Okay, so there's only one team, one school that represents the South Island. One represents the Hurricanes district, which is Wellington Central districts, all the way up to Taranaki, yes, across to Gisborne, and including Wellington. One represents the Chiefs region, which is largely centred obviously on Rotorua, Tauranga, Hamilton, and then one represents Auckland, so the Blues region, Auckland, Northland. The Auckland Blues representative is Westlake Boys High School, who are from the North Shore and shouldn't be there by all rights. Tauranga Boys College, as you would have heard Alwyn just say, beat Hamilton Boys High School, who are the sort of reigning champs and have dominated this competition for a long time. Well, they won't be there. Palmerston North Boys High, after all the shenanigans and controversy, will be representing the Hurricanes. And Southland Boys High School will be representing the South Island. So, yeah,